If you rent in New York, something fundamental just shifted beneath your feet, and most people haven't caught up to it yet. The state's rent regulation framework, the same system that shaped housing stability for millions of tenants across the city and beyond, is being rewritten in real time. Not through some distant legislative proposal or theoretical debate, but through changes that are already moving through the pipeline. And the implications go far beyond New York. This isn't about a single policy tweak. What's happening now could redefine the balance between tenant protections and landlord rights in ways that ripple through the broader U.S. housing market. New York has always been a testing ground. What happens here tends to inform housing fights in California, Oregon, and every other state grappling with affordability crises and rent control debates. The timing matters. With inflation still squeezing household budgets, eviction rates climbing in major metros, and institutional investors continuing to consolidate rental properties nationwide, the stakes around tenant protections have never been higher. If New York's framework shifts, other states will be watching closely, and some will follow. So if you think this is just a New York story, you're missing the larger pattern taking shape. Because what's unfolding in New York right now is part of a much broader conversation that California has been wrestling with for years. And the way these two states handle tenant protections will likely define the future of renting across the entire country. New York and California together represent nearly 1 in 5 Americans. They're home to some of the most expensive housing markets in the world, and they've both become laboratories for tenant rights legislation that other states either emulate or explicitly reject. When New York moves on rent regulation, California lawmakers take notes. When California passes statewide rent caps, New York advocates push for similar measures. It's a feedback loop that shapes housing policy from Seattle to Austin to Miami. The current overhaul in New York centers on a few key areas that have been simmering for years. Rent stabilization laws, which cover roughly 1 million apartments in New York City alone, are being reevaluated in ways that could either strengthen tenant protections or create new loopholes for landlords to exit the system. There are discussions around how vacancy bonuses work, how major capital improvements get passed on to tenants, and whether certain buildings should remain under rent regulation at all. These aren't abstract legal questions. They translate directly into whether a family can afford to stay in their apartment after a lease renewal, or whether a landlord can justify raising rent by 30 or 40% under the guise of renovations. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it's happening against a backdrop of sustained housing pressure that hasn't let up since the pandemic. Rents nationwide spiked dramatically in the aftermath of the eviction moratorium's ending. Cities like Phoenix, Nashville, and Tampa saw year-over-year rent increases that broke records. Even markets that were traditionally affordable became unaffordable seemingly overnight. And while some of that pressure has cooled slightly in recent months, the structural imbalance between supply and demand hasn't been resolved. We're still not building enough housing to keep pace with population growth and household formation, and the housing we are building tends to skew toward the higher end of the market because that's where the profit margins are. California has been living in this reality for decades. The state has some of the most severe housing shortages in the country, and its policymakers have tried just about every tool in the box to address it. There have been upzoning efforts to allow more density near transit. There have been state mandates requiring cities to plan for more housing units. There have been debates over inclusionary zoning, affordable housing bonds, and streamlining the permitting process. And yes, there have been rent control measures. In 2019, California passed Assembly Bill 1482, which instituted statewide rent caps tied to inflation, plus a few percentage points, and it also created just cause eviction protections. It was a landmark piece of legislation that fundamentally changed the tenant-landlord relationship across the state. But even with those protections in place, California tenants are still struggling. The rent caps don't apply to newer buildings or single-family homes owned by certain types of landlords. There are carve-outs and exemptions that limit the law's reach. And because the cap is tied to inflation, during periods of high inflation, the allowable rent increases can still feel substantial to a family living paycheck to paycheck. A 7 or 8% rent hike might be legal under the law, but it can still push someone to the breaking point if their wages haven't kept pace. So the conversation in California hasn't ended. Advocacy groups continue to push for stronger local rent control measures, and in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco, local ordinances go further than the statewide law. But those local measures face constant legal and political challenges, and the landscape remains fragmented and confusing. Now, back to New York. The reason this overhaul matters so much is because New York's rent regulation system has been in place in various forms for nearly a century. It was born out of housing shortages after World War I and has evolved through waves of reform and deregulation ever since. At its peak, rent regulation covered far more units than it does today. Over the decades, landlords found ways to move apartments out of the system through vacancy decontrol, luxury deregulation, and other mechanisms. By the time we reached the 2010s, tenant advocates were sounding alarms that the regulated housing stock was shrinking and that middle and working-class New Yorkers were being priced out of their own city. In 2019, the same year California passed its statewide rent cap, New York passed sweeping reforms to its rent laws. The state legislature closed many of the loopholes that had allowed landlords to deregulate apartments. They eliminated vacancy bonuses that let landlords raise rents steeply between tenants. They capped how much landlords could charge for major capital improvements and individual apartment improvements. The reforms were hailed as a major victory for tenant rights, and they did meaningfully strengthen protections for people living in rent-regulated units. But the aftermath has been complicated. Landlords and real estate interests immediately pushed back, arguing that the new rules made it financially unviable to maintain older buildings. Some property owners stopped investing in repairs, claiming they couldn't recover the costs. There were reports of buildings falling into disrepair because landlords said they had no incentive to upgrade units if they couldn't pass those costs on to tenants in meaningful ways. Meanwhile, tenant advocates countered that these were scare tactics, that landlords were still making money, and that the real issue was that some property owners had over-leveraged themselves with debt and were now looking for any excuse to squeeze more revenue out of their tenants. What we're seeing now, in early 2026, is the continuation of that battle. There are calls from some quarters to revisit parts of the 2019 reforms. Some lawmakers and real estate groups argue that adjustments are needed to incentivize building maintenance and to prevent a deteriorating housing stock. Others argue that any rollback would be a betrayal of tenants and would open the door to the very abuses the reforms were designed to prevent. And in the middle of all this are the tenants themselves, many of whom are just trying to understand what their rights are and whether their rent is about to go up. The challenge here is that housing policy is incredibly complex, and there are legitimate tensions that don't have easy answers. On one hand, tenants need stability and protection from predatory rent increases. Housing is not a typical consumer good. You can't just move every time your rent goes up, especially if you have kids in school, a job nearby, or family ties to a community. Displacement has real costs, not just financial, but social and psychological. On the other hand, buildings do need maintenance and capital investment. Roofs need to be replaced, boilers need to be updated, facades need to be repaired. If landlords genuinely can't afford to make those investments, buildings deteriorate and everyone suffers. The question is whether the current system strikes the right balance, and whether the complaints from landlords are grounded in reality or are simply attempts to maximize profit at tenants' expense. This is where the California experience becomes instructive. California has tried to thread this needle for years, and the results have been mixed. Rent control, when implemented locally, has provided stability for some long-term tenants, but it's also been blamed, fairly or not, for discouraging new construction in certain areas because developers don't want to deal with rent restrictions. Economists have debated this for decades. Some studies suggest that strict rent control reduces the supply of rental housing because landlords convert units to condos or take them off the market. Other studies suggest that the benefits to tenants in terms of stability and affordability outweigh the costs. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle, and it likely varies depending on how the policies are designed and enforced. What's clear is that rent control alone cannot solve a housing crisis. You need to build more housing, period. California has been slowly coming to terms with this reality. The state has passed legislation to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, to streamline approvals for certain types of development, and to penalize cities that consistently fail to meet their housing production targets. But even with these efforts, the state is still tens of thousands of units short of where it needs to be every single year. The politics of housing production are brutal. Everyone agrees we need more housing in theory, but in practice, many communities resist new development. There are concerns about traffic, about school capacity, about neighborhood character, about gentrification. These are real concerns, but they also create a situation where new housing gets blocked at the local level, which perpetuates the shortage, which drives up prices, which makes life harder for everyone who doesn't already own property. New York faces a similar dynamic. The city hasn't built nearly enough housing to keep up with demand. There are neighborhoods where zoning restrictions prevent anything but single-family homes, even though those neighborhoods are well served by transit and could easily support more density. There are political battles over every major development project. Community boards wield significant power and can delay or derail projects for years. Meanwhile, the population isn't shrinking. People still want to live in New York. The jobs are there, the culture is there, the opportunity is there. But if you can't afford a place to live, none of that matters. So when we talk about New York's rent rules being overhauled, we're really talking about a much larger question. How do we house people affordably in cities where land is scarce and demand is high? And how do we do that in a way that's fair to both tenants and property owners, while also ensuring that we're actually building the housing we need for the future? These questions don't have easy answers, and they're not unique to New York or California. Cities across the country are grappling with them. What makes this moment feel particularly urgent is that the economic conditions are shifting in ways that could make everything harder. Interest rates, while down from their recent peaks, are still elevated compared to the near-zero rates of the 2010s. That makes borrowing more expensive for developers, which can slow down construction. It also makes it more expensive for landlords who are refinancing debt on their properties, which can create pressure to raise rents. At the same time, inflation has eaten into household budgets. Wages have grown, but for many people, they haven't grown fast enough to keep up with the rising cost of housing, food, healthcare, and everything else. The financial margin for error is thinner than it used to be. For tenants, this means that even modest rent increases can be destabilizing. $100 or $200 a month might not sound like a lot to someone who's financially comfortable, but for a family that's already spending 40 or 50% of their income on rent, it's the difference between making ends meet and falling behind. And once you fall behind, it's incredibly hard to catch up. You might get hit with late fees, you might damage your credit, you might face eviction proceedings. The downstream consequences of housing instability ripple through every other aspect of life. Kids do worse in school. Health outcomes suffer. Job performance declines. It's not just a housing issue, it's a societal issue. For landlords, especially smaller landlords who own just a few units, the economics are also challenging. Property taxes keep going up. Insurance premiums, especially in states prone to natural disasters, have skyrocketed. Maintenance costs are rising because labor and materials cost more. If you're a landlord who bought a building 20 years ago and your mortgage is paid off, you're probably doing fine. But if you're a more recent buyer who took on significant debt to purchase a property and your costs are climbing, while your ability to raise rents is capped, you might genuinely be in a tough spot. This doesn't mean we should abandon tenant protections, but it does mean we need to think carefully about how policies are structured and whether there are ways to support responsible landlords while still protecting tenants from exploitation. The conversation happening in New York right now is essentially about recalibrating that balance. Are the current rules too restrictive? Are they not restrictive enough? Should there be more flexibility for landlords to recover the cost of major improvements? Or would that just create a new loophole for rent increases? Should there be more aggressive enforcement to make sure landlords aren't gaming the system? Or would that create an adversarial relationship that makes everything worse? These are the kinds of granular policy questions that get hashed out in legislative committees and city council meetings, and they matter enormously for the people whose lives are affected. California will be watching closely because whatever New York does will influence the conversation here. If New York rolls back protections and it leads to displacement and hardship, California advocates will point to that as evidence that we need to strengthen our own laws. If New York finds a way to maintain strong tenant protections while also incentivizing building maintenance and new construction, California might try to replicate that approach. The two states are in constant dialogue, even if it's not always explicit, because they're dealing with the same fundamental challenges in different contexts. And it's not just California and New York. Washington state passed statewide just cause eviction protections. Oregon passed rent control at the state level. Minnesota and Illinois have had active debates about expanding tenant protections. Even traditionally conservative states have seen local efforts to address housing affordability, though those efforts often get preempted by state legislatures. The point is, housing is a national issue, and the solutions being tested in places like New York and California will shape the options available everywhere else. What's frustrating for a lot of people is that this all feels so preventable. If we had built enough housing over the past few decades, we wouldn't be in this crisis. But we didn't. We underbuilt for years, and now we're playing catch-up while also dealing with all the political and economic complexities that make it hard to build quickly. It's a mess, and there's no simple fix. But that doesn't mean we should give up or resign ourselves to the status quo. It means we need to be thoughtful, pragmatic, and willing to try different approaches until we find what works. For tenants in New York, the immediate question is what these proposed changes mean for their rent and their security. Will they still be protected from arbitrary evictions? Will their rent still be capped at reasonable levels? Will their building be maintained, or will their landlord use the new rules as an excuse to let things deteriorate? These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're real questions that will determine whether people can stay in their homes or whether they'll be forced to leave neighborhoods they've lived in for years. And for the rest of the country, the question is what lessons we can take from New York's experience. Housing policy is hard, and there are no perfect solutions, but we can learn from what works and what doesn't. We can support policies that genuinely protect tenants without creating perverse incentives that make the problem worse. We can push for more housing production while also ensuring that new development serves a range of income levels, not just the wealthy. We can hold landlords accountable for maintaining safe and habitable conditions without demonizing everyone who owns rental property. It's possible to do this well, but it requires nuance, compromise, and a willingness to prioritize people's actual needs over ideology or profit. This is the moment we're in. New York is rewriting the rules, and what happens there will reverberate far beyond the city limits. California is watching. Other states are watching, and millions of renters across the country are watching, because they know that their own futures might depend on how this plays out.